Oahu Hawaii, early 1942. This incredible and rare colour footage captures a unique moment in American history. Cluttering the sandy bottom of Pearl Harbor are the hulks of wrecked and burnt-out warships, the once mighty force of the American Pacific Fleet. Far from the US mainland, this group of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers is America's vaunted vanguard in the Pacific Ocean, standing against one potential foe, the Empire of Japan. Relationships between the two powers had deteriorated badly through the 1930s. It was up to the mighty American warship force to protect the nation's interest in the largest ocean on Earth. And then, one morning in December 1941, everything changed. A surprise attack devastated the American force as it lay at anchor. The plan was to knock the Pacific Fleet out of the war once and for all, before Japan's troops could move swiftly through, capturing key territories before negotiating a favourable peace. But Japan's planners underestimated America's resolve. In part 1 of this series, we looked at the effects of the damage done to Pearl Harbor, the ships that were hit, and the horrible losses that were suffered. We learned about the frantic rescue mission as heroic dock workers and naval personnel cut and hammered their way through solid steel to desperately reach their trapped friends and comrades in arms. Weeks later, with the rescue and early recovery stage over, a monumental task had to be completed. America's Pacific battleships sat burnt and battered, some completely wrecked. The task to recover, repair, and salvage these monstrous machines would be an epic that would last the majority of the rest of the war. It would prove that America was not yet out of the fight, and while victories were fought and hard won on the Pacific's rolling blue waves, other kinds of success was found back at Pearl Harbor, where it had all begun. But before the salvage teams could tackle these enormous battleships, they had to solve other problems first. Destroyers shattered by bombs and magazine detonations, cruisers hit with torpedoes. The path to refloating Pearl Harbor's battleships wouldn't be easy, and the initial run of successes would culminate in the complete restoration of the mighty USS Nevada, a battleship many thought was a write-off. Little did they and the Japanese military know that this incredible machine would soon be back in action. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the second part of the incredible true story of how they salvaged Pearl Harbor. A Navy vessel slips slowly past the charred hulks of once proud battleships. It's early 1942. Only weeks earlier, Japanese aircraft had roared in and done terrible damage. The men salute their fallen comrades, hundreds still trapped inside the upturned hulk of USS Oklahoma with no chance of escape. For days and weeks, sentries guarding the wreck had tried their best to ignore the sounds of tapping coming from deep within the ship. But now, Oklahoma is silent. But she would not be left there forever. Instead, an audacious plan was in place to bring Oklahoma and all the other ships resting on the harbour bed back from the dead. Immediately after the attack on Pearl, the total number of battleship tonnage left sunk rounded out at no less than 122,600 tons of dead weight. 4 battleships were sunk completely, and 4 more were damaged. Arizona's magazine had erupted in a sickening cloud of flame and smoke that took over 1,100 lives. Oklahoma had been hit with so many torpedoes that she rolled onto her back with her propellers pointing clear at the sky. Nevada had managed to make steam and began to shoot down as many aircraft that she could, but the heroic flight did not go unnoticed, and as she moved for the harbour exit, she was smashed with 6 bombs and beached, smoking on the shore. Some smaller ships had it worse. USS Shore's bow section was essentially gone. Cassin and Downs were shattered by bombs and fires. Oglala, the plucky little mine layer, had almost broken her back when a torpedo detonated against the cruiser Helena moored alongside, and she capsized at the wharf. Then there was the damage to facilities. The naval yards, the airfield, hangars collapsed, aircraft burnt out. All of this damage had to be seen to and reversed because Pearl Harbor, the once quiet little Pacific bastion of the US Navy, had suddenly found itself at the forefront of a vicious and cruel conflict. The United States was going to war. As American military planners began to organise their response and prepare for battles to come, back at Pearl Harbor, the monumental task of clearing up was already underway. A simple triage system was instituted that saw the wrecked and damaged warships ranked by priority. Overseeing the operation was Captain Homer M. Wallen, who took over from his predecessor in January 1942. It was obvious he had a huge job on his hands. Over 100,000 tons of battleship littered the harbour bottom. Officers were assigned to different ships as project directors and specialists assigned for specific jobs like diving and ammunition handling. Then the salvage division could properly get to its work. First, the less damaged ships were cleared out. USS Pennsylvania, the battleship, had escaped any serious damage and she steamed out under her own power. Then it was the turn of the cruisers Honolulu and Helena. With the least damaged ships cleared and the new dry dock rushed to completion by the Pacific Bridge Company, attention could at last be paid to the more damaged vessels. These wounded warships were tended to by order of priority. Obviously, a few would need to be left until the last because they were so badly damaged, but inspections showed that a few of the massive battleships could be patched and floated out from the chaos with a little elbow grease. USS Maryland had been moored inboard of Oklahoma. It meant that Oklahoma had eaten the majority of the torpedo hits and shielded Maryland from them, but Maryland became the target of dive bombers instead. Two 15-inch armour-piercing bombs, thought to have actually been made from converted battleship shells, had plunged straight through her steel deck plates. Although they detonated, fortunately her magazines didn't go up like Arizona's did, but a massive hole was torn in the ship's forecastle deck and a second bomb caused huge flooding in the bow. She dropped by about 5 feet into the water forward. Japanese pilots reported that Maryland was sunk, but they were wrong. Remarkably, the ship's damage parties had contained both fire and flood and then left to help other ships burning nearby. But Maryland still presented an issue for the salvage team and the Navy Yard crews. She couldn't make it back to the mainland in this state, but there was no dry dock big enough for her at Pearl. The solution was ingenious. A caisson, a kind of watertight chamber, was built around the hole where the bomb's detonation had ruptured the ship's hull bow plates. Once welded together, the caisson could be used to keep Maryland dry, while the ship's forward compartments were pumped. The hole was patched, and Maryland set out for Puget Sound, Washington, where she arrived only 23 days after the attack. Within 2 months, she was back at sea and ready for action. The Japanese had thought Maryland sunk, but for the rest of the war, the ship proved herself to be very much a living threat, pounding Japanese positions at Tarawa, Kwajalein Atoll, Saipan, Leyte, Okinawa, and more. Pearl Harbor's first damaged battleship was back in the fight. Next on the list for the salvage team was USS Tennessee. Like Maryland, she too had been moored inboard, closer to the shoreline, and had been spared the devastating impact of torpedo hits, but instead she too had been raked with bombs from above, which cut through her decks and her plating. Fortunately, their detonations were of little force. Some seemed not to have gone off at all. Tennessee's biggest problem, though, was that she was firmly stuck. When the bombs started falling, Tennessee obviously couldn't move anywhere since she was flanked on one side by fleetmate West Virginia and on the other side by the massive battleship mooring keys. West Virginia was hit so many times that she caught fire and sank to the bottom, wedging hard against Tennessee and forcing her against the keys. Then, as burning oil began to creep from other troubled ships nearby, Tennessee's crews had the clever idea of running the ship's engines slow ahead to fan the burning oil away. But even though the engines were turning, Tennessee didn't budge, and her mooring lines didn't tighten. She was clearly stuck fast. In the end, Arizona blew up and rained debris and fire all over Tennessee's decks. It looked like the ship was doomed to burn, so her magazines were flooded just in case. The fire was so hot from behind that the ship's stern plates began to buckle from the heat, and rivets even loosened. Through a Herculean effort, fires aboard were contained, but the oil burned on the water's surface for no less than 2 days after the attack. Penned in on all sides by ruined fleetmates, Tennessee had to wait her turn until Maryland was removed. Like a giant game of Tetris in reverse, this provided the battleship a path to be led out of her moorings, but the fact remained that she was still firmly wedged between West Virginia and the mooring keys. First, around 650,000 gallons of fuel oil, that's almost 2.5 million litres, were pumped out to lighten the ship, but still she wouldn't budge. It became clear that those huge concrete keys would need to come down if the battleship was ever going to move, so the Pacific Bridge Company got to work. Fortunately, with a background in bridge construction, they were well adapted for this kind of difficult task. On December 16th, the plan reached its crescendo. Dynamite boomed as the keys were blasted apart. At last, the trapped battleship was freed and nimbly slipped between the less fortunate West Virginia and Oklahoma. The Navy Yard men patched her ruptured hull plates and sent her on her way in a convoy with Maryland and Pennsylvania for Puget Sound and serious repairs. She too was back in action before the end of the year, and the ship would go on to see much heavy fighting for the rest of the war. As far as Battleship Row went, however, that was it for what could be considered easy wins. The remaining battleships were far too heavily damaged, and they would need extensive work to refloat. Arizona, Oklahoma, and Utah were so far gone that it was clear they could never serve again. There were two contenders for salvage though, USS California, sunk at her moorings, and then the other, USS Nevada, bombed out from above and beached in the sand. Clearly, Nevada would need a lot of work. In fact, many argued that she couldn't be saved at all. If an attempt at salvaging Nevada was to be made, it would clearly be a huge undertaking. Instead, for the time being, the Salvage Division's attention turned away from the battleships and onto the smaller craft which littered Pearl Harbor's facilities. If they could get some of these in action, then maybe, just maybe, they could pull off the impossible and refloat the massive battleships. USS Vestal was a prime target for repair because she herself was a repair ship after all and could be of some serious ongoing use to the operations. Vestal had been alongside Arizona when the battleship detonated. In fact, firefighting parties on Vestal's decks were blown clear by the sheer force of the blast. Aside from that, conventional 250-kilogram bombs had rained down on Vestal and pierced her heart. One detonated in a metal storeroom with no serious effect, but the second passed straight through and out the bottom, causing flooding. With the ship settling by the stern and Arizona a flaming wreck, it became clear that Vestal needed to get away from the carnage. Her skipper, Cassin Young, had been blasted off the ship when Arizona went up, but he swam back to take control of the situation, famously declaring, "Lads, we're getting this ship underway." When he stepped on board, they cut the ship's lines with axes as the burning fuel oil began to creep closer and closer. With engines turning slow ahead, Vestal limped free as her superstructure began to burn and her flooding grew worse. First, she had anchored, but in the end Young decided it was safer to beach his ship. She gently came to rest off Aiya Bay. It had been a heroic effort on a day of heroic deeds, and Cassin Young was actually awarded the Medal of Honor for his efforts to save his ship and her crew. And Vestal, despite being tied alongside the most horrendously damaged ship of the attack, was never sunk. Instead, her crew had first got to work helping on other damaged ships of Battleship Row, freeing trapped men in Oklahoma and others. Then, finally, it was their own ship's turn. She was in a unique position. Her own men were skilled repairers of ships. They swarmed about her like busy bees, cutting away ruined steel or welding new plates. In less than a week, all the holes had been patched, compartments were pumped dry, and damaged bulkheads were welded watertight once more. The work of Vestal's crew meant the Navy Yard teams could focus on the other ships. But then, eventually, Vestal would need proper repairs below the waterline. She was no giant, so she could easily fit in the harbour's dry docks. She went in for permanent repair and was all fixed up and finished by February 18th, 1942. She went on to provide invaluable assistance to damaged US warships throughout the entire Pacific campaign. And not just damage from the enemy either, but freak Pacific typhoons that tore steel like it was paper. Then there was the USS Raleigh, a cruiser, one of the old-fashioned Omaha class. She was berthed near Utah in a mooring point usually used by the aircraft carriers, and so it was that she, an outdated design, and Utah, a training ship, came under furious attack from Japanese planes that had expected the carrier fleet. Utah had been devastated and rolled over, but Raleigh's crews were able to overcome the odds and save their ship. The old cruiser was rocked with blasts, first from 2 torpedoes which caused flooding and a list, and then from a direct bomb hit which again passed clean through and exploded below her keel. As Raleigh began to list, her men began to free loose weight on the high side to prevent a full capsize, while others manned the AA guns to keep the enemy planes at bay, destroying no less than 5. Attempts at counterflooding the ship essentially caused her list to ease, and a barge was brought alongside to stop her from rolling or sinking completely. Fortunately, tanks containing thousands of tons of aviation fuel weren't breached, and no major fire broke out. With no deaths among her crew, Raleigh had escaped serious harm, and her crew had done a mighty job of keeping their ship afloat, earning them a commendation. Like other lightly damaged ships, the majority of the repair work could be completed by the ship's own crew, along with the repair ships and tenders. Raleigh was patched up, entered the Navy Yard dry dock on December 22, and was back in San Francisco for full overhaul in February. The old girl lived to fight another day, and fight she did, bombarding shore positions and enemy merchant ships throughout the Pacific. Work continued on with the lesser damaged ships. The seaplane tender, Curtis, which had engaged a Japanese submarine during the attack and then kind of brought down an enemy aircraft after it collided with her tall crane. Bomb damage meant her repairs were only finalised in May 1942. Then there was USS Helm, a destroyer. The warship had actually made steam to patrol for submarines out of the harbour when she was attacked by dive bombers. The bombs were so destructive, even a near miss could be dangerous. Helm suffered damage from a bomb blast alongside that ruptured plating and caused flooding. The repairs were fairly simple and straightforward, and the little warship was back in action in no time. So far, the enormous workload undertaken by the men of the Pacific Bridge Company, the Navy itself, and the Navy Yard was bearing fruit, but there was an obvious reminder of the real difficulties ahead. Applying simple repairs to bomb holes and ruptured plating on destroyers was one thing, but sitting at the entrance to Pearl was the burnt-out, bomb-riddled hulk of USS Nevada. Every single ship that came and went had to steam straight past her. The same was true of California, Oklahoma, and Arizona. These massive ships were a source of pride for the men of the Pacific Fleet, but the sight of them, sunken and broken, had instead become a source of distress to the entire base. The destroyers, Shaw, Cassin and Downs, and the small vessel Oglala were all officially regarded as lost too because the damage was so severe. The same was true of the battleships California and West Virginia. They were so badly damaged that originally it was thought they could never fight again. They didn't know it at the time, but the Salvage Division, recently renamed the Pearl Harbor Repair and Salvage Unit, was about to perform a series of miracles, and these ships were going to return from the dead. USS Shaw was one of those vessels thought initially to be so badly damaged as to be a complete loss. She'd been at a floating dry dock when she took 3 direct bomb hits. The resulting fires spread out of control, and she had to be abandoned. At 9:30 AM, Shaw's forward ammunition magazines detonated in a brilliant flash. Everything forward of the number 1 funnel was effectively wiped out. The floating dry dock flooded and sank, and Shaw's bow sank with it, but remarkably her stern section remained afloat. It gave the salvage unit an idea. The bow section was cut off entirely, and the rest of the ship, virtually undamaged, was towed and moored at the nearby docks. Here, the Navy Yard men got to work on a strange project. USS Shaw got a new, temporary fake bow. It would mean that the ship could steam under her own power out of Pearl and over to the west coast of the USA for permanent repairs. It didn't matter that her bridge had just been wiped out. The ship could be steered from her emergency after steering compartments just above the rudder, and a simple platform was constructed atop her tripod mast where officers could coordinate her maneuvering. By the end of January, the new bow had been fitted, everything was rigged up, and the USS Shaw was ready for her remarkable voyage. As she left the harbour, there was cheering from the crews as they watched this first, seriously damaged ship set to sea once more. It was a minor miracle because Shaw seemed to have returned from the grave. By the summer, Shaw was fully rebuilt and ready for action once more. In August, not even a year since the attack, Shaw returned to Pearl Harbor once again, looking a brand new ship, and she was very warmly received indeed. The sight of USS Shaw gave the salvage crews renewed hopes and vigour, but it couldn't be denied that the task ahead was still enormous. They were incredibly skilled workers, divers, riveters, carpenters, but there were some jobs that were impossible to pull off. USS Cassin and Downs had been in dry dock together, and repeated bomb hits and fires had caused magazine detonations similar to Shaw. But for these 2 destroyers, the result was far more destructive. Cassin's hull and keel were warped beyond repair. The whole ship hogged upwards in the middle by as much as 17 inches or 43 centimetres. Downs was similarly twisted and buckled, with her bow twisted high and her stern twisted low. Repairs got underway with holes being patched or plugged, pumps taking oil and water out, and cutters removing bent and buckled superstructure, funnels, and deckhouses. At first, it looked like Cassin and Downs might live to fight again, like Shaw had, but there was intense discussion around the viability of this. There could be no doubt that even with corrective action, the 2 destroyers would only ever really be suited to low-impact escort work or simple patrols. But ships' hulls back then were actually relatively simple and cheap to make. It was the engineering machinery that was complex and expensive, and inspections proved that Cassin and Downs' engines were in fine condition. The decision was made to scrap the 2 ships but preserve their machinery so that the engines could be fitted to new destroyers instead. Over 1,000 tons of machinery, pumps, turbines, fans, and many more were removed, restored, and carefully catalogued piece by piece. Most of the original hulls were scrapped through 1942, and by early 1944, the new ships were ready, appropriately named Cassin and Downs. In fact, Both vessels' undamaged 37-ton stern sections, which still bore their original nameplates, had been ceremoniously kept and grafted onto the new hulls. They both went on to fight against the enemy that had sent them to the bottom of the dry dock that December 1941, with many battle stars and medals won between them. With Cassin and Downes being tended to, the Pearl Harbor Repair and Salvage Unit was now also faced with their most challenging jobs yet, the 6 battleships that were still sunk or beached around the harbour. These would not be ordinary repair jobs. The ships were monumental in their scale. West Virginia was herself about 22 times larger in displacement than Cassin or Downes. The first contender for salvage work became Nevada. She was beached off Hospital Point at the entrance to the harbour, and while her damage was severe, she wasn't a shattered hulk like Arizona, nor was she overturned like Oklahoma or Utah. Nevada had fought like a lion. Early on, she'd been hit by a torpedo, but steamed out under her own power. Japanese pilots attacked her furiously and scored 5 bomb hits almost all at the same time. Fire ravaged her superstructure, and then Nevada came gently to rest, intentionally beached to prevent a full sinking. Her bow was in deeper water, while her stern touched the shore. Her usual draft was around 28 feet, but now the water rose nearly 2 stories higher. The damage was incredible. Photographs show her forecastle deck buckled and bent from bomb hits and fire damage. It seemed incredible that a ship so badly ruined could ever be refloated or put into service again, even despite the impressive work done to Shaw, Cassin, and Downes. Captain Homer Wallen, the salvage officer, remained hopeful about Nevada. He thought her older style of reciprocating steam engines would be more easily salvaged than other ships' turbine electric machinery, but others weren't so sure. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself, commander of the Pacific Fleet, thought Nevada would never sail again. He had toured the harbour but found the destruction overwhelming, despite having read all the reports and briefings beforehand. "This is terrible, seeing all these ships down," he had simply said. It's easy to see why Nimitz thought Nevada was a total loss. It was up to the salvage unit to prove him wrong. Immediately after the attack, Nevada's flooding began to make her settle deeper into the water until her stern came to rest on the bottom with a slight list to starboard. Now, this was actually optimal for the salvage crews, who used anchors and lines to hold her in that position until the ship could be patched and refloated. By securing the ship in place, it meant there was no risk of her being carried off by a high tide, only to sink in deeper water and block the channel. In early 1942, crews got to work on their biggest job yet. First, the ship would need to be patched. Bomb damage forward in the hull was covered with simple wooden patches that could be driven hard up against the plating with bolts. As the compartment inside was pumped dry, the water pressure itself would then act to hold the patch in place. Other areas of damage along the hull needed more specialist attention. Skilled divers, some of the best in the world, got to work down below in their hard hat diving suits, welding over holes and fixing ruptured plate seams. They came largely from the Pacific Bridge Company, support vessels, the Destroyer Rapid Repair Unit, and even Nevada herself. It was stressful, dangerous work. The ship could shift slightly and send an unprepared diver over the side where water pressure could crush his entire body up into his helmet. That had actually happened to a diver on the Empress of Ireland back in 1914 who fell only 65 feet or 20 metres deeper. This incredible danger was faced every day through the course of no less than 400 successful dives and 1,500 hours spent underwater cutting, drilling, excavating, and dynamiting. No diver was injured or lost in the fight to get Nevada seaworthy. Soon, it became clear that a huge torpedo hole needed a patch big enough to cover an area of about 48 by 25 feet, that's some 15 by 8 metres. Now this was in particular quite complex, because it was a part of the ship's hull where a torpedo bulge was installed, and matching the curvature of the bilge would be tricky. Fortunately though, the overturned hull of Oklahoma provided the perfect template-making opportunity because the ship was the near-identical sister to Nevada. The patch was made to fit Oklahoma, and by nature it would therefore fit her sister. But this proved too large even for the skilled salvage crews to handle. Attempts at fitting the patch proved futile, and even after a month of hard work, divers at last gave up. Totally unbeknownst to them, a projection from the hull, blown out by the explosion, was preventing the patch from seating properly and creating the seal it needed to fit. In the end, it was decided that the large hole could simply remain because the internal bulkheads would be reinforced from the inside and then relied on to prevent any wide-scale flooding as the ship was slowly refloated. With patches in place, the moment of truth had arrived. Would Nevada float again? All remaining oil had been pumped out of her tanks and the ship's weight lessened by removing guns, munitions, heavy equipment, and anything that might keep her fixed to the harbour's silt. With a mechanical roar, the pumps burst to life, and slowly, Nevada began to be pumped dry, bit by bit, compartment by compartment. This was not an easy job. If certain compartments were drained faster than others, the ship could capsize completely. Hoses were rigged to suction pumps of all sizes in a complex arrangement, and slowly, Nevada began to rise again, a steady fountain of water bubbling out from the pumps over the side of the ship. As the compartments were pumped dry for the first time in nearly 3 months, teams were sent in to clear them of any contaminants or remnants of fuel, ammunition, or even organic materials like food and paper. It was a hellish scene. The mixture had become like a thick stew which coated every bulkhead and deckhead. In particular, there was found an enormous store of what had once been fresh meat, but by that point was entirely rancid. In other compartments still lay the bodies of their fallen comrades, badly decomposed and requiring identification. They were sent off to the Navy hospital. This wasn't just unpleasant work, it also proved deadly. On February 7th, Lieutenant James Clarkson was in a confined space in the steering engine room when he was overcome by gases. A machinist mate who rushed to his assistance was overcome too, and later died in hospital. Analysis showed that the gas was likely hydrogen sulfide, completely odorless and the result of the decaying organic material in water like the paper or the meat. The salvage unit learnt their lessons the hard way. A lot of this kind of work was completely uncharted territory. The loss of these 2 men was a blow, but it couldn't detract from the eagerness of those who had toiled and suffered so much already to get the job finished. From then on, water samples were rigorously tested for dangerous levels of gases, and they would be detected. Salvage men were clad in thick rubber boots and overalls with breathing apparatus like gas masks as they worked inside the refloated ship, hosing away all the oil and grime. To help the men, ventilation was provided with portable fan units, and rudimentary lighting was also rigged up as well since the ship's own fittings were, of course, non-functional. That's not to say they were all finished for good though. The ship's wiring was actually found to be in fine condition. It just needed to be dried out. Machinery was taken out for repair and salvage. This was likely thanks to a wonder substance called Tectil, the kind of rust preventative. It dried out the components and applied a protective layer of film which would prevent any more corrosion. From then on, Tectil became the main weapon for the salvage unit on all the remaining ships like Nevada. In fact, they were so successful at this kind of work that about 95% of Nevada's original electrical machinery was totally repurposed and saved. On February 12, 1942, the men of the salvage unit beamed with immense pride. They had done it. Nevada was again afloat, a triumphant sight for all of those who'd worked so hard on her the previous weeks. Even Chester Nimitz must have been shocked by the sight as the ship prepared to be taken under tow for dry docking. This itself was no easy feat. If the ship broke her lines, she would not be able to correct her course, and after all that hard work, she could end up sinking or blocking the channel. Everybody held their breath as the small boats wrestled Nevada under their control, and they brought the ragged battleship successfully to dry dock number 2, only recently completed, and the only dock large enough for a ship of Nevada's size. Watching proudly over the whole operation was Nimitz, who had thought the ship to be a complete write-off. He was happy to be proven wrong. Incredibly, the work to restore Nevada was successful. The hulking wreck was transformed by an army of men from the naval yard into something resembling a functioning warship once again. But of course, her first voyage would need to be back to the US mainland for proper, permanent repair. The Navy Yard workers did their best to get the ship's galley in working order, her machinery and her electrical fittings functional, and the bomb holes patched. Once in dry dock, the magnitude of the damage done to the battleship was clearly evident. No wonder the divers couldn't fit that patch on. On April 22, not even 5 months after the attack, Nevada steamed out in a convoy under her own power for Puget Sound Navy Yard. The ship Nimitz and others thought was done for emerged from that yard in October completely rebuilt, a formidable, modernised battleship with a crew keen on vengeance. After a stint in the European theatre, including supporting fire at D-Day, Nevada rejoined the Pacific Theatre for the invasion of Iwo Jima, where her massive guns hurled shell after shell at the enemy. Nevada anchored just 500 metres, only 600 yards offshore for maximum destructive effect. It was a triumphant moment for a warship that had been considered doomed for the scrapyard and which had been the place where 52 men had fallen. Now, as Nevada's guns roared with flame and fury, their sacrifice could at last be avenged. But back in February 1942, as Nevada first rose from the harbour floor and the salvage team could celebrate their enormous triumph, there was still a conspicuous sight that couldn't be forgotten. Yet more battleships, each more or less the size of Nevada, sat sunk on the harbour bottom, needing the same treatment. These would prove even more challenging because of the sheer scale of the damage sustained. In part 3 of this series, we'll look at how the lessons learned in recovering Nevada were put to use to bring one more battleship, USS California, back from the dead, how incredible engineering techniques were then used to right the capsized Oklahoma, and the horrifying discoveries that were made when the hull could at last be cleared. It would prove to be the final chapter in an incredible tale, the largest salvage mission ever undertaken. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.